Sometimes, the scariest stories aren't born from imagination, they're pulled from the shadows of reality. Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where true horror lives. Dare to listen? Let's begin. When Marcus Jenkins booked the remote Breckenridge cabin for his family's vacation, he was looking forward to an escape from their busy city lives. The listing promised a peaceful retreat surrounded by dense pine forests, a sparkling lake nearby, and plenty of hiking trails. It was perfect, or so he thought. Marcus, his wife Claire, their teenage daughter Lily, and 8-year-old son Evan arrived late in the evening, the sun just a faint orange smear on the horizon. The dirt road leading to the cabin was rough, overgrown with weeds, and eerily quiet. Even the sound of the car engine seemed muffled, as though the surrounding forest swallowed every noise. The cabin itself looked quaint at first, rustic wood paneling, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. But as Claire pointed out, there was something slightly off. The windows were dirty, as though no one had cleaned them in years, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. "I thought you said this place had great reviews," Claire said, eyeing the peeling paint on the front door. "It did," Marcus replied, scrolling through his phone. But as he swiped, he noticed something strange. The listing was gone. After unpacking and eating a quick dinner, the family settled in. The cabin had no Wi-Fi and barely any cell service, but Marcus assured everyone it would be nice to unplug for a few days. Lily complained about her room smelling like wet wood, and Evan refused to sleep alone because he didn't like the shadows in his room. Claire agreed to let him sleep in their bed for the night, brushing off his fears as typical kid imagination. At 2 a.m., Claire woke to the sound of scratching. At first, she thought it was a branch scraping against the cabin, but the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It seemed to be coming from inside the walls. She nudged Marcus awake. "Do you hear that?" Marcus grumbled, sitting up. The scratching stopped. "It's just animals. We're in the middle of nowhere," he said, lying back down. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. The next morning, Marcus took Evan to explore the lake, leaving Claire and Lily behind. Claire decided to tidy up the cabin while Lily sat on the porch reading a book. Around mid-morning, Lily came rushing inside, pale as a sheet. "Mom, there's someone in the woods," she whispered. Claire grabbed a kitchen knife and stepped onto the porch. "Where did you see them?" Lily pointed toward the tree line. For a moment, Claire saw nothing but the dense woods. Then she spotted it, a figure standing just beyond the shadows. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in dirty clothes that hung loosely from his frame. His face was obscured by the shade of the trees, but she could see his head tilting slightly, as though watching them. "Marcus?" Claire called out instinctively, though she knew it wasn't him. The man didn't move. Claire grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her inside, locking the door. She peered out the window, but the figure was gone. When Marcus returned, Claire told him what happened. He dismissed it as a local hiker, but Claire wasn't convinced. That night, the scratching returned. It was louder now, moving from one wall to another as though circling the cabin. Evan woke up crying, saying he heard someone whispering his name. Lily came running into their room, trembling. "Mom, there's someone outside my window." Marcus grabbed a flashlight and went to check. Claire begged him not to go alone, but he brushed her off. The cabin was surrounded by darkness, the kind that felt suffocating. As Marcus shone his flashlight around the property, the beam caught something, a handprint smeared across the living room window. It wasn't the size of a normal hand. The fingers were impossibly long, the print streaked with something dark and oily. When he came back inside, Marcus tried to downplay it, saying it must have been there when they arrived. But Claire noticed he was gripping the flashlight tighter than before. By the third night, the tension in the cabin was unbearable. The family agreed to leave in the morning, but the forest had other plans. Around midnight, the scratching turned to banging. Heavy, deliberate knocks echoed through the walls, shaking the furniture. Evan screamed as his bedroom door slammed shut on its own. Claire and Marcus rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Inside, Evan was sobbing, saying, "It's in here with me." When the door finally gave way, the room was empty. Evan was gone. The family searched the cabin frantically, calling Evan's name. Marcus ran outside with the flashlight, shouting into the woods. Claire and Lily stayed inside, paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, Claire saw movement through the kitchen window, a flash of Evan's red hoodie darting between the trees. "He's out there," she yelled, grabbing Lily's hand and rushing outside. Marcus was already running toward the figure. "Evan!" he shouted. But as they got closer, Claire realized something horrifying. The figure wasn't running away. It was leading them deeper into the forest. When they finally reached the figure, it turned to face them. It wasn't Evan. It was the gaunt man from before, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, his mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. Behind him, the forest seemed to shift and breathe, shadows twisting into monstrous forms. The family ran back to the cabin, but the door wouldn't open. The scratching and banging grew deafening as the shadows closed in around them. Marcus threw his weight against the door, and it finally gave way. They piled into the car and sped down the dirt road without looking back. When they finally reached the nearest town at dawn, the locals listened to their story with grim faces. "You stayed at Breckenridge?" one man asked. "That place has been abandoned for decades." The Jenkins family never found an explanation for what happened. Evan wouldn't talk about what he saw in the room that night, and the cabin was officially listed as condemned. But sometimes when Claire lies awake at night, she hears it again, the scratching. And she wonders if the forest ever really let them leave.
It was the trip of a lifetime. 5 friends, Emily, Jason, Brooke, Eric, and Sarah, had planned a weekend getaway to Willow Creek, a small, isolated town nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. They'd rented a cabin that was said to have the best views of the surrounding wilderness. It was cheap, too, suspiciously cheap, but they chalked it up to the off-season. The cabin was gorgeous but old, with creaky wooden floors and a faint scent of dampness. Surrounding it were towering trees, their branches interlocking overhead like a natural cathedral. A narrow path led to a nearby stream, where the water sparkled under the fading sun. "Perfect spot for a ghost story," Jason teased as they unpacked. Brooke rolled her eyes. "Don't start, Jason. You know Sarah hates that stuff." Sarah chuckled nervously but didn't respond. She had been uneasy since they arrived, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Something about the way the shadows lingered between the trees felt wrong. The first strange occurrence happened the next morning. Emily and Brooke went for a hike while the others stayed behind. Halfway down the trail, they spotted something unusual etched into the bark of a tree, a symbol that looked like an eye with jagged lines radiating from it. "What do you think it means?" Brooke asked, running her fingers over the carving. "No clue," Emily said, snapping a photo. Probably some wannabe witchcraft or local kids messing around. But as they continued walking, they saw the symbol again and again. It was on nearly every tree along the path, some carvings so fresh the bark was still flaking off. They hurried back to the cabin, uneasy, but trying to laugh it off. That night, the group gathered around a campfire outside the cabin, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Jason was in the middle of a particularly gruesome tale when Eric suddenly froze. "Did you see that?" Eric whispered, staring into the trees. "See what?" Jason asked, annoyed at being interrupted. "There was someone." Eric trailed off, standing to get a better look. The others turned toward where he was pointing, but saw nothing. Just the dark forest and the faint glow of the firelight reflecting off the branches. "You're imagining things," Jason said, shaking his head. But Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Later that night, everyone was asleep when a loud knock echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock, knock. Jason groaned and rolled over. "Probably an animal," he muttered, pulling the blanket over his head. But the knocking continued, louder and more insistent. Knock, knock. Emily got up to check the front door, but when she opened it, there was no one there. Just the cold night air and the oppressive silence of the forest. When she closed the door, she noticed something on the wood. 3 long, deep scratches. The next day, the group decided to leave early, but Eric's car wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and groaned, but it was as if something was draining the battery. They were stranded. Tensions ran high as the sun began to set, and the group huddled inside the cabin. Jason suggested playing cards to pass the time, but no one was in the mood. That's when Sarah screamed. Everyone turned to where she was pointing. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the trees, motionless. It was tall and humanoid, but its limbs were unnaturally long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "It's just a trick of the light," Jason stammered, though his voice shook. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching. That night was chaos. The knocking returned, this time from all sides of the cabin. The windows rattled, and the door shook on its hinges as if something was trying to break in. Eric and Jason barricaded the door with furniture while the others hid in the bedroom. The sounds grew louder, scratching, banging, and then a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls. Suddenly, the bedroom window shattered. Brooke screamed as something reached inside, a long, dark arm with clawed fingers. "Run!" Eric shouted, pulling the others toward the back door. The group sprinted into the forest, the sounds of heavy footsteps and snapping branches close behind. They stumbled into a clearing, gasping for air. The shadowy figure emerged from the trees, its form more defined now. Its face, or what passed for a face, was a featureless void, but its presence exuded malice. Then the whispers began. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. Sarah dropped to her knees, clutching her head. "Make it stop," she screamed. The figure took a step forward, and the whispers ceased. The silence was suffocating. Suddenly, a blinding light engulfed the clearing. Emily opened her eyes to see the figure retreating, melting into the shadows as if consumed by the forest itself. When the group woke, they were lying on the dirt road leading to the cabin, their car idling nearby with the keys still in the ignition. None of them could remember how they got there, and the cabin was gone. In its place was an overgrown lot, as if it had been abandoned for years. As they drove away, Emily checked her phone and found the photo she had taken of the strange symbol on the tree. But now, the symbol wasn't just carved into bark, it was burned into the photo, glowing faintly as though alive. Nestled at the edge of a dense forest in rural Maine, the hollow house had been abandoned for decades. Its dark windows stared out at the overgrown yard like empty eyes, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still. Locals told stories about the house, a place where people went in but never came out. Children dared each other to approach it, but none dared to linger long. In 1987, the house drew the attention of Kate and Mark Sanderson, a young couple searching for a secluded home to escape the bustle of city life. Despite the warnings from townsfolk, they purchased the property at a rock-bottom price, brushing off the rumors as superstition. Their first night in Hollow House was uneventful. The air was cold, the walls creaked with age, and the wind howled through cracks in the wood. Kate dismissed the sounds as normal for an old house, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mark joked about the ghost stories, but his laughter felt forced. When they went to bed, they noticed the room seemed colder than the rest of the house. Their breath misted in the air despite the heater humming downstairs. Kate felt uneasy but said nothing, chalking it up to her imagination. At 3 a.m., Kate woke to a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping coming from the wall near the bed. Tap, tap, tap. She nudged Mark awake, but by the time he stirred, the sound had stopped. "It's probably a mouse," he mumbled before turning over. But as Kate lay awake, staring into the darkness, she thought she saw a shadow shift at the edge of the room, just out of reach of the moonlight filtering through the window. Over the following weeks, strange things began to happen. Kate noticed scratches appearing on the walls, thin, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. Mark dismissed them as old damage, but Kate insisted they were new. One morning, while cleaning the upstairs hallway, she found a long gash running down the wooden banister. It was too deep to be from normal wear and tear. Later that evening, as Mark went to fetch firewood from the shed, Kate stayed inside, unpacking boxes. She heard heavy footsteps overhead, even though no one else was home. When Mark returned, she told him about the noises. He climbed the stairs to investigate, but found nothing. "This house is old," he said. "Wood shifts and creaks. Don't let it get to you." That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. Kate woke Mark, who heard it too. They searched the room but found no source. As they settled back into bed, a sudden, ear-piercing bang came from downstairs. They raced to the living room to find the front door wide open, swinging in the icy wind. The next day, Kate called a local historian to learn more about the house. She discovered it had once belonged to the Hollow family, who mysteriously disappeared in the 1920s. Their belongings were left untouched, and no bodies were ever found. Over the years, several families had moved in, only to leave
abruptly, citing strange occurrences. Mark was skeptical, but Kate felt the weight of the house's dark history pressing down on her. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she felt a chill pass through the room, followed by a faint whisper that sounded like her name. "Mark," she called out, but he was in the garage. She spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Kate." Things escalated quickly. Mark began waking up with deep scratches on his back, as if something clawed at him while he slept. They heard whispers in the night, doors slamming on their own, and objects moving inexplicably. One night, Kate saw an apparition, a tall figure standing at the end of the hallway, its face obscured by shadows. It didn't move, but she felt its cold gaze bore into her. When she screamed, it vanished. Mark finally agreed to call a priest. Father O'Connor, an experienced exorcist, arrived days later. As he walked through the house, he grew visibly uneasy. He blessed each room, muttering prayers under his breath until he reached the basement. "There's something here," he said, his voice trembling. The couple had avoided the basement since moving in. The stairs were unstable, and the air was thick with mold. But Father O'Connor insisted they go down together. As they descended, the temperature plummeted. The smell of decay filled their nostrils. At the center of the dirt floor was a patch of ground that looked freshly disturbed. "Something was buried here," the priest said. He began to pray, but before he could finish, a deafening roar echoed through the basement. The lights flickered, and a shadowy figure materialized, its form twisting and writhing like smoke. Kate and Mark screamed as the figure lunged toward them, its eyes glowing red. Father O'Connor shouted prayers, holding up a crucifix. The shadow recoiled, shrieking, before vanishing into the darkness. The priest urged the couple to leave immediately. They fled the house, leaving their belongings behind. Later investigations uncovered human remains beneath the basement floor. It was believed to be the Hollow family, but no official cause of death was determined. The house was condemned and eventually demolished, but locals claim the land is still cursed. Some say they hear whispers when they pass by at night, and others swear they've seen figures moving in the shadows of the trees. Kate and Mark never spoke of their experience again. They moved far away, carrying the scars of their time in the Hollow House, scars that lingered, unseen but ever present. To this day, no one knows what truly haunted the Hollow House, but one thing is certain: some places are better left abandoned. In the sleepy town of Blackwood, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, the Hart family was well known and well loved. Emily Hart, their 16-year-old daughter, was bright, kind, and the star of the local high school's track team. But one crisp autumn evening in 1995, Emily vanished without a trace, leaving the town haunted by her disappearance. On the evening of October 14th, Emily left her home to meet her friends at the town fair. She promised her parents she'd be back by 10 p.m., but she never returned. When the clock struck midnight, her parents called the sheriff, who launched a search party. Emily's friends claimed she had left the fair around 9:30, taking the forest path home, a shortcut through Blackwood Woods. It was a path she knew well, but she never made it out of the trees. The search party combed the woods for days. They found no footprints, no signs of struggle, just Emily's necklace, a silver locket her mother had given her. It was hanging from a low branch, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. As the weeks passed, rumors began to spread. Blackwood Woods had always been shrouded in mystery. Hunters spoke of strange sounds, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and sightings of shadowy figures that disappeared when approached. Some believed Emily had been taken by a drifter or wild animal, but others whispered darker theories. They spoke of the Keeper, a malevolent entity said to haunt the woods, luring people into its domain and trapping their souls forever. The Harts refused to give up hope. They hired private investigators and psychics, but nothing brought them closer to finding Emily. Her disappearance seemed destined to remain a mystery until 5 years later, when she came back. It was the anniversary of Emily's disappearance when she reappeared, walking out of Blackwood Woods as if nothing had happened. She was wearing the same clothes she had on the night she vanished, and she looked exactly as she had 5 years earlier, completely unchanged. When her parents saw her, they wept with relief, but their joy was short-lived. Emily seemed different. She couldn't explain where she had been or how she had gotten back. Her memories were fragmented, and she spoke in a flat, emotionless tone. She didn't remember the search parties, the posters, or the years that had passed. At first, the Harts chalked it up to trauma, but strange things began happening around Emily. Emily refused to eat, claiming she wasn't hungry. She would sit by the window for hours, staring at the forest. At night, her parents heard her whispering in her room, though she was alone. Her once warm personality had turned cold. She rarely smiled and avoided physical contact, even with her family. Her dog Max, who had adored her before, now cowered in her presence, growling and whining whenever she came near. One evening, her mother walked into Emily's room to find her standing in the corner facing the wall. "Emily?" she asked nervously. Emily didn't respond. When her mother touched her shoulder, Emily turned around, her eyes wide and unblinking. "They're coming," she said in a monotone voice. Emily's father, Tom, decided to install cameras around the house. One night, as he reviewed the footage, he noticed something chilling. In the footage from the backyard, just beyond the tree line, shadowy figures could be seen moving between the trees. They were tall and thin, with unnaturally long limbs. Tom showed the footage to the sheriff, but the sheriff dismissed it as a trick of the light. Frustrated, Tom decided to investigate on his own. That night, armed with a flashlight and a shotgun, he ventured into Blackwood Woods. As he moved deeper into the forest, the whispers began, soft at first, then louder, surrounding him. "Leave. She's ours now." Terrified, Tom ran back to the house, swearing he would never enter the woods again. A month after Emily's return, the Harts woke to the sound of their front door slamming. They rushed downstairs to find Emily gone. The door was wide open, and muddy footprints led out into the yard, disappearing into the woods. Panicking, they called the sheriff and grabbed their flashlights, following the trail as far as they could. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. "She belongs to us," they hissed. The trail led them to a clearing deep in the forest. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, and in the middle stood Emily. Her back was to them, and she was surrounded by the shadowy figures from the footage. "Emily!" her mother cried, rushing toward her. Emily turned slowly, her eyes black as coal. "You shouldn't have come," she said in a voice that wasn't her own. Before anyone could move, the shadows closed in, engulfing Emily and dragging her into the ground. The Harts screamed, but it was too late. Emily was gone, and the clearing was empty, save for the faint smell of burning leaves. The Harts moved away from Blackwood shortly after Emily's second disappearance. They told no one what had happened, fearing they would be labeled insane. Blackwood Woods remains as ominous as ever. Locals say they still hear whispers in the trees and see shadowy figures at the forest's edge. Some claim to have seen a girl in the woods, wearing a silver locket and staring out at the world with black, soulless eyes. Whatever happened to Emily Hart, one thing is clear. Once you enter Blackwood Woods, you may never truly escape. On a quiet cul-de-sac in the suburbs of Detroit stood a house no one wanted to own. 312 Whispering Pines Lane was its address, though neighbors referred to it as the Watcher's House. The modest two-story home with peeling paint and overgrown bushes had been empty for years. Despite its affordable price, every family that moved in left within months, citing strange occurrences and an overwhelming sense of being watched. In the summer of 2009, the house found new occupants, the Grayson family. Moving from a cramped apartment in the city, they saw the house as a fresh start. Melissa and James Grayson, along with their 10-year-old son Ethan, dismissed the rumors about the house as small-town superstition. They couldn't believe their luck at finding such a deal, but they would soon learn some deals come at a cost. The first few weeks in the house were uneventful, aside from minor annoyances. The lights flickered occasionally, doors creaked, and Ethan complained about the sound of footsteps in the attic. "It's an old house," James reassured him. "It settles." But Ethan wasn't convinced. One night, as he lay in bed, he swore he saw a shadow pass by his window. He rushed to tell his parents, who chalked it up to his imagination. Melissa, however, began to notice oddities as well. Every morning, she would find objects moved from their original places. Chairs slightly pulled out, picture frames tilted, or cabinet doors ajar. Once, she found the salt shaker balanced precariously on the edge of the dining table, a position she was sure she hadn't left it in. Then came the notes. Scribbled on scraps of paper, they were left in random spots, under Ethan's bed, tucked into the folds of the couch, even inside Melissa's purse. The messages were chillingly simple. "I see you." One night, Melissa woke to the sound of faint tapping. She nudged James, but he was fast asleep. The tapping grew louder, coming from the hallway outside their bedroom. Heart pounding, she crept to the door and peeked through the crack. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the end of the hallway, facing their room, its head tilted unnaturally, as though listening. Melissa slammed the door and shook James awake, but when he checked the hallway, it was empty. "You're just stressed," James said. "This move has been hard on all of us." But Melissa knew what she had seen. Ethan, meanwhile, began talking about his new friend. He described him as a tall man who wore a dark suit and had no face. Melissa dismissed it as an imaginary friend, until Ethan said the man told him secrets about the house. "He says he watches us all the time," Ethan whispered one night. "He says he's inside the walls." Disturbed by Ethan's comments, James decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, he ventured into the basement. The air was damp, and the walls were covered in strange, dark stains. As he examined the space, he noticed something odd. One wall didn't match the others. It was hastily constructed, the bricks uneven and the mortar crumbling. Curious, James grabbed a hammer and began chipping away at the bricks. It took hours, but eventually he uncovered a hidden door. The door was old, its wood warped and splintered. When James pried it open, a foul stench wafted out. Inside was a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in crude carvings, stick figures, symbols, and what looked like tally marks scratched into the plaster. In the center of the room was a rotting wooden chair with restraints attached to the arms and legs. James stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. As he turned to leave, he thought he heard faint whispers, like children crying out in the distance. After discovering the room, the activity in the house grew worse. The footsteps in the attic became constant, echoing through the house at all hours. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the once subtle whispers turned into guttural growls. One night, Ethan screamed from his bedroom. Melissa and James rushed in to find him curled up in a corner, pointing at his bed. "He's under there!" Ethan cried. James lifted the mattress, but found nothing. Still, Ethan refused to sleep in his room after that night. The final straw came one evening when Melissa was home alone. James had taken Ethan to a friend's house, leaving her to enjoy a rare moment of peace. As she sat in the living room, she heard a creak behind her. Turning, she saw the tall figure standing in the corner, its head almost brushing the ceiling. It moved toward her, slowly and deliberately. Frozen in terror, Melissa couldn't scream. The figure leaned down until its featureless face was inches from hers. Then in a low, gravelly voice, it whispered, "Get out." Melissa fled the house, calling James and demanding they leave immediately. The Graysons packed up and left that night, abandoning most of their belongings. They moved in with Melissa's sister while searching for a new home. A month later, the house burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances. The fire marshal never determined the cause, but some neighbors claimed they saw figures moving inside the house as it burned, tall, shadowy forms watching silently through the flames. The lot where the house once stood remains vacant, overgrown with weeds. Neighbors avoid walking past it, especially at night. Some say they still hear tapping sounds and faint whispers coming from the empty lot. Others claim to see a tall, dark figure standing where the house once was, watching, always watching. The Graysons never spoke publicly about their experience, but Melissa privately told friends that she still felt like she was being watched, even in their new home. Sometimes late at night, she would find notes tucked into unexpected places, scraps of paper with the same chilling message, "I see you." Thank you for joining me in the shadows of the creepy corner. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like and share it with someone who dares to listen. Remember, truth is often scarier than fiction. Until next time, stay safe, but keep an eye over your shoulder. You never know who or what might be watching.